Hello Traveler, and welcome to the second part of the Invokation Akademy Review Session for version 4.8. In case you missed the balance changes, make sure to check out part 1, but I also need to clarify 2 mistakes from that video. First, the +1 stack to Cyno's passive that you get from using his skill is not actually tied to the talent, but just built into his base skill by default. This in fact has made Cyno super potent, and for sure we'll see him moving up in the tier list when I go update that later. Second, Yunjin's burst did not go up in damage, so she only has that nerf to her status. With that many balance changes, mistakes were bound to happen, but now it's time to talk about the new cards. Now, I originally planned to cover both the characters and action cards today, but turns out one of our action cards was secretly 10 cards in a trench coat. So instead for today, we'll just do the action cards, and there will be a part 3 for the character cards coming soon. But time to dive right in, starting with some new weapons. Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword, quite a mouthful. Well, this is a new claymore, which counts up in stacks each time you play a unique action card that wasn't originally in your deck. Once it gets to 2, 4, and then 8 points, you get +1, +2, and +3 damage respectively. There's 2 things to note. Like Jet, it counts the entire game, so it's fine if you play your cards first and equip the weapon later. Second, action cards not originally in your deck, this is the same condition as End of the Line, can come from both action and character cards that for instance shuffle things into your deck like Treasure or a Pep, or ones that generate a random card like Mimir or Senyata. Do keep in mind, if you do happen to generate a card that was originally in your deck from those, it won't actually count. Also, since it specifies unique, if you for example play 2 treasures, it's only 1 stack, not 2. Now, when I first looked at this seems pretty bad, as if you think about it, you need to play 4 different cards to be better than White Iron Greatsword. But as it turns out, satisfying this condition is way easier than you might think, mostly because of the new MVP of RNG, Serene, which we'll talk about later. This means that 4 stacks is pretty easy and 8 is actually quite doable. Once you do get up to 8 stacks, the weapon becomes pretty crazy, basically giving you a permanent Wolf's Gravestone, turning any character into a beast. Noelle in particular is actually quite potent with this due to her defensive breastplate, allowing you to get more use out of that extra damage. Having now played with this card a few times and against it, it's actually quite good, but keep in mind, you must play Serene if you do play this claymore. Another new weapon, Prospector's Drill, while equipped, will twice a turn block 1 damage for the active character at the cost of discarding 1 card in your hand. Note that if you have no cards to discard, then it won't block damage. Each time this happens, you do gain a point that stacks up on the weapon, then whenever the character uses a skill, all points are consumed and you deal +1 damage and draw 1 card for each point. Do note, similar to End of the Line, you only always get +1 damage no matter how many points you're using at once. But unlike End of the Line, there's no cap to how many points you can stack up on the drill. This card is actually quite strong. Yes, you are discarding cards, but you eventually get those cards back, so you are getting free damage mitigation. Blocking 2 damage each round is actually quite a lot, and stacks particularly nicely with other barrier effects like Daya. Of course, if you couldn't tell, this card was kind of tailor-made for Chevreuse, and the idea is you can discard the bullets she creates, allowing you to apply Pyro when your character is hit. I'm sure you've seen Cyno Chevreuse decks already, and it is definitely quite strong there as well, as Cyno can also equip the drill. This card is definitely quite strong and well worth trying if you have spear users. Gladiator's Triumphus is a new artifact that once a round discards normal attacks by 1 die if you have 2 or less cards in hand. As always, 0 cost artifacts are always better than they look, and any aggressive decks that can use up cards quickly might be able to make good use of this. Yunjin particularly synergizes well, as she already encourages you to play out her cards to enable her status. Thankfully though, the effect is limited to once a round, so you can't quite abuse it so much. Unlike a lot of other normal attack discounts as well, this one works on elemental die, which also means Linny's prop arrow can benefit from this as well. That said, requiring you to be below 2 cards definitely does limit its potential, particularly in round 2, so it looks pretty niche and mostly for aggressive normal attack based decks. I'd rather lose money myself. That's the name of the card, not me. I'd rather not lose money, thanks. But when played for the rest of the round, every time your opponent generates 2 dice, you gain 1 Omni. Thankfully, the effect doesn't count dice created by this card, so if you and your opponent both play 1, it won't go crazy with the dice. Well, this is a pretty obvious attempt to answer those decks that generate a ton of dice through either Gilded or Treasure, though as we know, both those decks already did get a nerf. The effect is powerful, of course. Played at the right time, you'll either force your opponent to delay their combo for the turn, or else risk giving you a lot of dice which you can use to counter attack. In some ways, this card does a lot of the same things as Passing of Judgment. You either force your opponent to delay, or they'll simply play out their turn in the hope that you don't have anything to punish them. But like Judgment, if your opponent suspects this card and goes first, they can always choose to play out all of their dice generation immediately rather than saving it for later to play around this card. So if you're playing casually, I don't recommend playing this, as you probably won't run into all that many decks that generate enough dice consistently to matter. Like situational cards like Send Off or Directional Blast, this targets a very specific type of deck, and while that could be relevant for competitions, for the average player, you're better off just making your own deck better than trying to make an opponent's deck worse. Still, if you have a friend that loves to play with Gilded or Treasure, you can surprise them with this, but overall, probably not that great. Next up, ta-da! Again, that's the name of the card, I'm not doing a bit. This deals 1 physical damage to your active character, then draws 1 card during the end of that round. Okay, at first this card looks like it doesn't make any sense, almost a weird forbidden knowledge. Why would you add this to your own deck? But the key here is it does physical instead of piercing damage, which means in fact it shatters frozen characters, notably your own. That's right, this card, for the cheap cost of 3 damage to a character, will get you out of freeze, and currently the only card that can do so. So is this the answer to freeze decks? Yes and no. If you know for sure you are playing against freeze, having one of these can be pretty useful, particularly if you have enough healing to tank through the damage. But of course, most of the time you don't know, and the card is useless against any non-freeze deck. Plus, 3 damage is quite a lot. One small synergy to consider: if your deck does have a lot of effects that trigger off self-damage, for example, Heart of Cavarena, Prospector's Drill, or Tenacity, you can use this to trigger those effects out of nowhere and surprise your opponent. Provided your deck does have those cards, then it could be worth playing this just in case you match up against freeze sometimes, as long as you can make use of it outside of freeze decks. But just like our last card, probably best you leave this out of the average deck, but can be a good choice in the right metagame, or if you just really hate freeze. Alright, and we've saved the best and the most complicated card for last, Serene. You've probably already seen this played quite a lot, but still may be confused about what it actually is doing. Well, it's simple. Each round she generates 1 random Melusine Support card and puts it into your hand. This happens when you play it, and then at the start of each round, so make sure you leave enough room for her card and not overdraw. Okay, so what exactly is a Melusine Support card? Well, here's where it gets complicated. In fact, there are 10 different cards that this can create, and you've probably seen a lot of them played, but maybe not all of them yet. They have a wide range of effects, and we'll go over them, each of them one by one, in order from what I think are the worst ones to the best ones. Alright, here we go. First up, Verda, who adds 2 random arcane cards to your hand and also restores the arcane legend use for both sides. Now, while this sounds nice, it's honestly just too expensive at 2 cost, particularly when arcanes are already pretty situational. Plus, there's a small chance giving your opponent their arcane back might actually come back to bite you. In general, if you do get this, you're better off just using it as tuning fodder unless you really want to gamble. Coming in at number 2, Lutein. You draw 2 cards, but both sides now get a status which causes the active character to either heal 2 or take 2 piercing damage after their next 2 skills. Note that this doesn't go away at the end of the round and lasts until you actually use it up. Now, the reason why this is bad is that it's simply far too random. Losing 4 HP to this while your opponent gains 4 is a sure way to lose a game you were going to win, and it's simply not worth that risk for just 2 cards. Of course, in a pinch, if you are already losing, this might be a good gamble to make, but usually I just recommend using it as tuning fodder. We have Topias at number 3 with a similar effect, drawing 2 cards, but instead, each time either you or your opponent play a card, you'll randomly discard 1 or draw 1 card. Note that playing Topias will count as well, so you'll immediately trigger this effect to either draw or discard 1. Again, the reason why this is down here is it's just simply too random. However, unlike Lutein, one way you can play around this is to make sure it's the last card you play in a round, which means at most you'll only discard 1 card. It's not as bad as Lutein, but still not great. Number 4 and 5 are somewhat tied, Kosanziana and Laume. Kosanziana gives you 2 random weapons, while Laume gives you 2 random artifacts. In most cases, the cards you actually get from these will most likely be unusable, but because they cost 0, they more or less act like a Bestus, which isn't the worst. Every now and then you'll get something nice, which is a bonus, so not exciting, but at least there's no risk to playing these. Serene, that's right, she has her own support, is number 6, giving 2 random food cards. Now, unlike the last 2, the average food is much more usable for any character than the average weapon or artifact, which makes this quite a bit better. Occasionally, this can clutch you some healing, and at worst is again a Bestest. At number 7, we have Therona, who gives you one super awesome event card at the end of the round. Now, unlike the last 3, which are completely random, super awesome event cards actually does mean something. These will always be either an elemental or regional resonance. That's right, you could, for example, get a Nemo or Hydro Res in a deck that doesn't have that, or even something like Mondstadt Resonance. Do note though, you can't get Abyssal Summons or Fatui Conspiracy from this. Resonance cards are some of the most powerful cards in the game, so getting 3 of them, even if they're random, is really great, though Therona is a bit slow. One thing you want to keep in mind about resonances, Dendro Resonance can in fact buff any reaction damage, not just Dendro reactions, which can be quite important. Unfortunately, Pyro and Geo Resonance, however, are locked to their elements and aren't going to work if you don't have them. Alright, now we get to our top 3, and coming in at number 8, Puka, who fills both side support zones with companions. Obviously, be careful when playing this, as gifting your opponent a free Paimon can be pretty costly. However, since you're the one playing the card, you can control when you play it, and provided you're giving yourself more companions than your opponent, on average, this should work out pretty nicely. And hey, maybe even get another Serene. Of course, not all companions will be good for your deck, but on average, it's pretty decent value. And coming in at number 9, the second best Melusine support is Canotilla. Like Therona, this adds 2 awesome event cards to your hand. Now, even though this costs you dice, the fact that you get them right away is pretty important. It's like a better strategize. Getting high impact resonances like Anemo, Cryo, or Hydro can really help out in the right situation. Of course, in a slower match, Therona will be better cause it does give you 1 more card for 1 less die, but in general, getting cards now is pretty important. So, who is our top Melusine? Well, coming in at number 10, it's Sluasi. This card copies the top 3 cards from your opponent's deck and puts them in your hand. First, as a baseline 1-cost draw 3, that's already incredible, and as long as your opponent is playing good cards, you'll be drawing good cards as well. It also has a hidden benefit of letting you know when your opponent is going to draw before they do, so you can actually craft plans around that knowledge. Okay, that was a lot. Now, I don't recommend you actually go and memorize all these effects. The only thing you need to know is how good is Serene overall. Okay, before we get to that, whether she's actually strong or not, she's incredibly fun, and I do encourage you to try her out if you haven't already. Even though it is a lot of RNG, these effects are unpredictable but add a lot to the fun. Overall, she does provide a lot of raw card value, but honestly at 2 cost, that's probably a little bit too expensive for what you get on average. So I wouldn't recommend putting her in a deck you actually want to win with. The one exception, of course, is if you're playing the Overlord Sword. In that case, you really do need Serene to generate enough cards of different names to stack that damage up, as each one of these supports counts for a different name. Well, there we have it, all of the action cards for version 4.8. If you've been watching my Duelist Theaters, you'll know I'm having a ton of fun in this version, and we haven't even gotten to talking about the characters yet. So go out there, try some decks with these new cards, and may the Serene Gacha be in your favor. If you are a newer player, be sure to attend the TCG 101 series to level up your Genius Invocation game. If there's anything you'd like to see in an upcoming video, drop a comment and I'll see how I can help. Be sure to enroll in our courses by subscribing so you can be notified when a new lesson is available. Until then, class dismissed!